All right, well, thank you guys so much. It's an honor to be here presenting to you guys. This is an amazing conference so far. First time attending for myself, definitely not the last. Having a great time, especially on the CTF. I'm over there kind of hacking away, so good times. My name's Tom Hegel. I'm actually the director of threat research now at ProtectWise. My team is the 401TRG. It's our internal threat research group. We're basically responsible for a lot of the intelligence and detection capabilities of our product. And if you're not familiar with our product, I'm not going to talk about that much, but just for some context around our data and what I'm doing with it, is we're an NDR platform. We basically collect and retain a near infinite amount of full PCAP data for very large organizations around the globe. And that's where a lot of our detections and so forth comes to produce talks such as this. So in this talk, I'm going to really be talking about kind of an introduction to uncovering state-sponsored attacks originating from China, and to give you an example of, to kind of scope this in a little bit, I'm going to be focusing on an actor group or entity that we call the WinT umbrella, or WinNTI, depending on how you want to call it. But let me go and get started. So agenda, I'm going to give a quick overview of the actor. This talk's a little bit different from the ones that have been going on so far this morning. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the intelligence aspect to it and really kind of show how we started to use SuriCata to fill in some of the detection aspects to catching this group across our customer base, and then some of the stuff we do on top of SuriCata to really kind of help fill those gaps, which I think will help give a lot of you guys on the dev side insight into maybe potential features and so forth. I'm going to talk about kind of two stages of attacks. Early stage, going after the easy targets to basically build up the arsenal, and then using that arsenal in later stage attacks, going after the high-profile organizations and so forth. And then talk about some kind of detection mechanisms at each stage of a general attack that we tend to observe with this actor group. So like I mentioned, the actor group's name is WinT umbrella. It's obviously, quote unquote, an umbrella term. We basically say WinT umbrella because a lot of the actor groups that we kind of cluster into this overall entity, they share so many resources, people resources, technical resources, and a lot of public reports on this entity tend to use different names such as Lead, Wicked Panda, Axiom, and so forth. But we tend to group a lot of these into just the WinT umbrella kind of cluster. And we attribute these guys with high confidence to the Chinese Intelligence Apparatus, just based off of being involved in many incident response engagements and then research alongside everything we've kind of caught here that I'll be reviewing. To give some context, general targets, high technology gaming organizations tend to be on the initial side to try and build up kind of their arsenal, which I'll add some context to here in a second. The later stage attacks go for the high impact, very politically focused agenda around defense industry, political opposition, just political intelligence in general. And it tends to be very wide on the initial side, so target and compromise as many as you can. And then on the highly targeted side, on the political side, is when you start to get focused down on a handful of organizations across the globe. If you're interested in learning about these guys, I'm going to keep this really high level just because of the time. But I have a full report on all the technical details of this actor group. If you're interested in learning that, I'll have some references at the end. So the target locations of this attacking entity, for the attacks that we observe, obviously it kind of varies quite a lot, especially depending on your telemetry as a vendor and so forth. But based on our solution, we are able to kind of build out some general target locations. And we have some primary targets and then secondary targets. Primarily, we see these guys operating in the United States and East Asia. The ones in East Asia tend to be almost like the B team. This is where a lot of the interns on the operator side will kind of practice and do a lot of fun stuff to kind of build up their skill set and so forth. So it's really easy to catch them in East Asia organizations. United States, not so much. Europe is kind of spread between both of them as well. And then the secondary victims tend to span into organizations that are have employees outside of their nation and so forth. So they're not specifically targeting India in general. It's just kind of those organizations that they're after tend to have a presence in those nations as well. So motivations. I mentioned building up their arsenal to try and use against the higher valued organizations. The initial attacks tend to go after code signing certificates. This is to pretty much go after gaming organizations, primarily smaller software shops, IT shops as well. And they go after these code signing certificates to then steal them and then sign additional malware. And then use that malware against these highly valued organizations. And they do that because, hey, having a piece of malware signed and valid by Apple is a good way to not get caught. So then they have these secondary objectives, and this really kind of depends on the individual operator on the attacker side. It's kind of just some kind of moonlighting activity we see by the individual operators where they're looking for any way to make some quick cash on the side while they're actually conducting their operations for their government. And being financially focused, they'll look for things like in gaming organizations, they'll try and compromise the actual gaming systems to either steal source code or any sort of virtual currencies for a video game and then profit from that later. We've also seen cases where these guys will seek out Bitcoin wallets internally from any like IT staff if they have them, and try and steal those wallets if possible. And like I mentioned, long-term mission, all these groups kind of clustered into the umbrella have the general shared agenda of a politically focused plan, going after the Chinese 5-year plan, so forth, and they all have different execution paths, but overall mission is politically focused. And some notes from our experience encountering these guys in the wild. They love to live off the land, so sometimes we encounter scenarios where they have zero malware and zero exploits, and they completely take down an organization. They have more of a persistent aspect than advanced. They're very patient. So what this means is we've seen organizations become targeted by these guys on like a monthly basis for years, and they get removed, they go back and target again. They will just continue to hammer. So they're very persistent. The advanced aspect is kind of not so much advanced sometimes. It depends on the individual teams and operators. Like I mentioned, sometimes we encounter what seems to be like their interns, while other times we encounter pretty much their A-team, where they have a lot more operational security and better tradecraft and so forth. And that kind of steps into the last point as well. There are a lot of aspects in terms of how these guys cover their tracks very poorly, leaving gaps and allowing us to track them, and then also just kind of allowing us to catch them in easy ways just because of kind of laziness or kind of an amateur tradecraft skill set. And just for some context, this is a huge topic by itself. We linked these guys to about over a decade of previously publicly reported attacks and coming from a wide variety of vendors. And we've seen these guys even active as of about last night up in my hotel room, kind of running into them, which was pretty fun. So the kind of kicked off with the Winty report in 2013 from Kaspersky, and this is to not be confused by their Winty malware. They have a custom backdoor which is called the Winty backdoor. So there's sometimes confusion between the actor name and backdoor. Nowadays, Winty is kind of just used to describe their malware outside of the umbrella term. But then there's a lot of other reporting, such as big campaigns that had tons of malware that were signed and valid by lots of gaming organizations and software organizations, from Novetta and Cylance and so forth. And then Trend Micro did some reporting on the individual operators, where they found and did some attribution linking it to an individual who, funny enough, is very excited about pigs. Yeah, it's weird. If you look at the social media, they did a funny report on it, and it's a lot of pig pictures in the report, so I don't know. They also have a lot of focus going after attacks against journalists. Citizen Lab did a report on it last year, and then we did some reporting when these guys did a shift towards going open source tooling. There's a ton of other links. I can't go into all of it, obviously, but you can find a lot of tactic overlap, TTP overlap, and infrastructure overlap in addition to code similarities from their malware going back to quite a few different operations, such as when the Operation Aurora against Google, the Bit9 compromise, more recently the CCleaner compromise, Shadowpad, and then if you want to get real crazy, you can go back to the great APT1 report. Not direct infrastructure overlap, since that's been quite aged at this point, but you can still see the general mission of a lot of these organizations, a lot of these entities overlapping greatly. And that's the link to the actual report. I'll have it again at the end, but this is just like a quick overview of the infrastructure overlap and a lot of linking we did. A lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about for the rest of this talk has been occurring in group 1, and that's just public infrastructure, domains, hashes, IPs, whois details, things like that. Number 2 goes down to organizations that are linked really strongly, that are actually legitimate organizations to the individual operators. Number 3 is where we start to step into identifying testing infrastructure from the operators that are playing with new attack techniques. And then number 4 is where you start to actually link it to the individuals on a personal level. And then 5 is some other previous reporting from Novetta on the Axiom. 6 is where you start to step into Operation Silence's reports on past CV, and then kind of go from there. And more importantly, number 8 is where you start to see the links to a lot of the politically motivated stuff. And this is where we start to link those initial attacks back to the highly deliberate and focused politically focused attacks. So 2017 attack, just to kind of give you guys some examples, we have kind of like a standard process they would follow in 2017, and it pretty much started with, obviously phishing. Phishing contains an email. It's a luring document or a luring email trying to say, hey, here's a resume. I need you to click this link for an applicant, and that link itself would then load a resume in the browser. We saw a couple different variations of it, such as resume being loaded in PDFs and Word documents and spreadsheets, but generally we did see it primarily happen in the browser through an HTML resume. And that resume loads a beef script in the background. If you're not familiar with that, it's the browser exploitation framework, which will then begin to try and exploit the browser, and if successful, it will then download a binary. So kind of looking at the step 1, this is a sample email we would see quite a lot. This is a template they would use. The translation from Japanese is right there, but this was sent to a lot of human resources, IT leadership, network security leadership inside target organizations. And then that link would then load the resume and go from there. And they would use certain formatting. In this case, you can see just like session equals and date, then an ID to identify the campaign. That's blurred. But this is where you start to use SuriCata a little bit. So depending on capabilities and placement of detecting with SuriCata, we can start to SIG the email template, start to SIG the actual link click. You'll notice that that's an HTTP link. Sometimes we can do just a link format or a formatted signature of just a PCRE looking for that particular session date and ID kind of format that they would continue to reuse over the months in 2017. This is just a sample of the resume. So this is what the user would see. They have some funny things in it where it's just, it's obviously fake, but we like to make good fun of it sometimes. So the beef hook that's loaded in the background of the resume, this is just a screenshot of the script, just doing the hook.js. Saw quite a different variations of it using, just bad domain, attacker-owned google-statistics.com or statics.com. And then sometimes they have the IP address. So quite a few different layers of inconsistency on this front. But generally what we start to see is beef kicking off. And this is one of the more interesting ways to try and start to catch these guys is just their basic reuse of public tooling. If you can link it to known infrastructure, that's when you can start to kind of build out this whole story. So you can see on the left-hand side, we have the GET request for hook.js, which is loading from the refer there, which is our real.html, so that's the resume. And hook.js is just the straight-up beef config. These guys, this is kind of one of those operational security things in a way. They would pretty much just do some basic, format or keyword changes in the beef config, but sigging off of that config download is obviously super easy. Those are two very inefficient rules on the right-hand side. Jack, don't judge me. But yeah, basically looking for the beef config download. Super easy way to kind of start to catch some suspicious stuff, and obviously really popular with any sort of red teaming exercises you encounter. So if beef executes through that pattern and you start to see an exploit come through and pop the machine, we see a lot of just jank and really commodity exploits, nothing like an ODay being used or browser or anything like that. Something that's been sitting on GitHub for like 5 or 6 years. That's typically what they tend to use. But if successful, we start to see malware downloads. So if you're a Windows host, they determine, Windows versus Mac just based off of the user agent when you click that link. So if you're a Windows host and you get popped by beef, it will then, we've seen cases where they download Cobalt Strike. And then that Cobalt Strike binary is just doing command and control over clear text, port 53. Really easy to see and start to kind of do some forensics on. And the right-hand side, you can start to see an example. These are from the ET guys of just beef headers coming inbound. That's kind of a good way to kind of catch a lot of the beef activity on the traffic itself. Now, if you're a Mac host, we started to see, this is where the things started to get a little bit interesting. Instead of using beef, it would just go right to a Mac app download. And the reason that it would do that is because that app that you're downloading was actually signed and approved by Apple, so it would install without a problem. And the reason is because that binary was signed with a code signing certificate that they stole from a previous victim. And so this is where we start to link multiple organizations. So it started to spread in kind of like a spiderweb fashion. If you encounter these guys a couple different times, can do some research on them. So you start to build out a victim list quite quickly. Basically, it opens an interpreter shell. We see a couple different variations of the type of malware that's being used in these cases, but in most of the scenarios, it's just a basic shell to try and get remote capabilities on the victim host. And that's obviously this is the port 53 shell we have into the victim network, and this is just the immediate log on from the attacker side. And you can see it's just doing some basic coverage at this point where he's trying to start to unset his size and so forth to try and cover their tracks a little bit. And you can see on the right-hand side, that goes down. It's just a TCP stream of the connection. So they would sit there for hours just kind of poking around and some post-compromise activities I'll talk about in a second. But yeah, super easy to kind of catch these guys. There's a million things you can do in terms of detections on this type of stuff. Just looking for unique commands going over non-standard ports is pretty interesting. But like I mentioned, we saw them do a big shift in 2017 to go into open source tooling. And like I mentioned, they're doing a lot of exploit codes for things that's just hosted on GitHub, Jenkins, Groovy Code exploits, and so forth. Cobalt Strike, they would use malleable C2 profiles that were available on GitHub. So creating a signature on that C2 profile is pretty handy. And then they just relied on Interpreter a ton for any other remote activity. This is an example of the webbug, the malleable C2 webbug profile. Left-hand side, you can see, that's the beacon outbound within the profile going to the C2 destination, trying to make it look like a Google Webbug submission. And then on the bottom picture on the left, you would see occasionally a binary being downloaded in response to that. And in that case, it's just an updated Cobalt Strike binary to continue to have an updated infection mechanism on the host. Right-hand side, this is just obviously a simple signature looking for a different section of this type of beaconing, but going after the malleable C2 profile as well. Really standard, HTTP content, nothing too crazy about it, but something like that is really, really strong in terms of catching really sketchy activity. Sometimes this is not unique to those guys. You'll see it in a couple other attacking entities as well. Post-compromise actions, again, they get on a network and they first seek the code signing certificates. If you're a software organization, that's the number one thing they'll go after. Obviously, they will use this against additional targets on the initial side, going after more software and gaming orgs. But ultimately, what they're going to do is use this information to go after, or use this cert to go and sign malware that they'll go after, political opposition with or high-tech organizations. So, as defenders, kind of the thing to keep in mind is even though it's signed, it's not trusted. So. We saw a lot of use of internal services for exfil. Email was a popular one. If they were successful in phishing someone, they will typically use any sort of cloud services of that individual, such as Google Drive or O365 and things like that for just exfilling data in a really easy, difficult to detect way. Credential theft, obviously they wanted to spread laterally. And I mentioned the financial gain as like a secondary objective. So this just to kind of give you an example. So say we encounter this organization or this attacker in victim organization number 1. We would scope that out and identify a group of malicious infrastructure such as domains and malware and malicious certs and so forth. And then we start to see some of that malware signed by additional organization. So in many cases, we were able to get our product and our team deployed into those secondary victims and then do the same thing and start to identify additional infrastructure. And doing that a couple times, we actually ended up identifying really interesting patterns, linking them almost all together in some way or another. And then we started to see even more interesting things, such as victim organizations being used as a proxy to compromise other organizations. So it became kind of a mess in terms of the incident response to try and kind of put this all together. So quite a bit of effort on our end to make sense of a lot of it. And this is ultimately what led to being able to link to so many interesting historical reports publicly. But doing this, you get a huge list of infrastructure. So, in our case, being able to manage and detect just malicious domains by itself, like that's a big list of just bad domains that IDS SIGs are for. And obviously managing an IDS SIG for every bad domain is not feasible sometimes. But in these cases, with this group, you tend to get value out of it, even if it's 6 or 7 years old. They'll tend to reuse that infrastructure. So, writing detections on old infrastructure isn't always useless. So 2018 attacks, more recently, we saw a shift towards services. So this is a phish, instead of the HR resume approach, this would be a service where it's, hey, check activity on this account, there's something suspicious going on. This is a Google one. We obviously saw Office 365. We saw some with payment or HR systems online and so forth. But that link they changed their approach a little bit. That link would go through a URL shortener. And a lot of times when they first started doing this, they were using the Google URL shortening service, which, like many URL shortening services, have public analytics. So they made some mistakes on that, allowing us to pretty much track their campaigns through their own services they used to track them as well. So this is where we start to step in some interesting detection mechanisms. We would detect, on our end, we'd create detections around just URL shortening services in general. They're very soft. You don't want to alert on that type of stuff, so we treat them as like hunting triggers. Hey, somebody browsing to a URL shortening service isn't bad. Those are used quite a lot, especially on like Android phones. They'll trigger constantly through like apps and stuff. But it's a hunting trigger, and you start to combine that with unique destinations, things you've never seen in your network before. That's when you start to get alertable events, things that you may want to know about. And then my favorite is you start to correlate those URL shortening services to known bad destinations, especially something targeted to or linked back to an APT like these guys. And that's when you start getting wake-up calls in the middle of the night, which happened all too often. Really fun, though. So some new techniques and some incident response notes that add some context. In 2018, their attack process, rather than the malware, their attack process shifted completely under TLS. No longer can we see, like binary being downloaded in the clear or something like that. It was all under encryption, typically using self-signed certs. Sometimes we'd see Let's Encrypt, and then sometimes, very rarely, we'd see them actually go out and buy a cert to go do this with. Like I mentioned, occasionally ran into cases where there was no malware, no exploits, and they would just rely completely on the phishing and then logging into cloud services with those credentials and then just siphoning off everything. It's always a fun incident response engagement when that happens. And then obviously we have cases where they are still using free and open source tools, ZX Shell, Tiny Shell, Meterpreter, things like that, super common with them as well. And they made a lot of mistakes during this process, which allowed us to do a good bit of location identification. I mentioned they used a lot of proxies. In some cases, we ended up identifying the operator making a mistake and forgetting to use a proxy, and allowed us to, with what we say is we associate with high confidence, back to the Chinese state intelligence, operators individually located in the Xishan district of Beijing. Again, post-compromise actions for more of the 2018 side of the house, we start to see network sweeping, scanning the network for web services, file shares, and so forth. Really easy things to create signatures on, but then you start to get a little bit more into the heuristic side of the house as well. And again, continued strong discipline to live off the land. If there's an approved VPN solution inside their network, they'll use it if they can. Later stage attacks, like I mentioned, politically focused, going after high tech, the actual individual focused individuals, and they use their weapon or their arsenal they've created from compromising those previous organizations. And this is where the A team really steps in. This is where we start to see a lot more of the advanced operational security and advanced tool sets and so forth. So really interesting to kind of see that gap between them. But they do tend to have a good bit of overlap. This is just one example. This is in 2017 we saw this one where it was going after individuals, and this is a luring document that had macro to download malware at this point, which would, in this case, be focused on somebody that was interested in sanctions against North Korea. So detections by attack stage for the minute I have left. So delivery, we would do a lot of, like I mentioned, just managing known infrastructure associated with these guys. DNS Rules is really helpful there. Soft detections for the URL shortening services, and then malware being downloaded. This is where I really loved using Yara. It allowed us to catch similarities in files and malware being downloaded that isn't always as easy as just blacklisting hash. So a lot more focus for the future rather than just trying to catch one binary. You're going to be able to catch a lot more that's similar down the road. Attack toolkits, generic web exploits. The work the ET guys have done to just catch generic exploits that become public, this is huge. This has helped us tremendously in terms of catching these guys without much work on our end. So kudos to those guys. Keeping up to date with any sort of attack frameworks, such as the malleable C2 profiles for Cobalt Strike, helped us a lot there. Generic HTTP signatures, nothing too crazy. So malware beacons, command and control. Obviously, we can do DNS. Sometimes we could do HTTP. Nowadays, we're focused purely on something like certs and JA3 hashes to be able to catch unique malware patterns. So really excited to see the integration of JA3 into Suricata. We're going to be using that quite a lot here in the future. So lots of potential there. Same thing with C2 responses going into the JA3S side. And then lateral movement. This is where we start to see quite a wide variety of attack techniques. So it really kind of comes down to being able to do any sort of heuristical changes in terms of unique protocols internally. That's how we tend to do it. There's typically not any sort of internal to internal exploits going on, but mostly just unique patterns of interest. And then actions on objectives. So this is where we started to see them, accomplishing their mission, scanning, testing services internally, unique hosts talking to every server in your network on, port 443 or something like that. It's been pretty interesting. Data exfil as well, and then just continued use of post-compromise toolkits inside your network. And this is where a lot of it comes down to the file analysis side of the house, for us at least. So Yara, file extraction via Suricata, and so forth has been tremendous in terms of allowing us to catch those capabilities. So lastly, some significant detection improvements. This is what we added kind of on top of the Suricata, most of the Suricata capabilities, but what helped me a lot in terms of catching these guys. General correlation capabilities, obviously. This is where we start to be able to really benefit from those softer detections like those URL shortening services, but also step into the area of being able to just find interesting patterns. You can create a lot of really cool stuff that just is kind of like a hunting trigger rather than just known badness. And in my mind, that's kind of the ultimate way to go, especially if you have the team to be able to start to triage those type of things. In terms of files being downloaded, if you see a clear text file going over the network, being able to do ClamAV and Yara on that file is huge. Yara is my best friend almost, so lots of capability there to try and catch interesting things that just fit, that are similar to previously known bad files. We start to step into a lot of the anomaly side of the house as well, using the ML side, looking for interesting traffic on the network that's unique to that network. First time you've seen somebody talk to this destination, or first traffic pattern you've seen for quite a while in your environment for a unique protocol, that starts to be kind of softer detections as well. And you can kind of combine those with a lot of those IDS SIGs. And then just easy ways to manage known bad infrastructure, huge. Especially with these guys, they just reuse infrastructure. In some cases, they have reused infrastructure for 6 or 7 years. So it's worth the effort to try and manage blacklists for these guys. So really high level, but a lot of that stuff, if you want more details, you can find it on our website. That's our analyst focus blog and GitHub, and obviously we're on Twitter if you want to send us some memes or something. Okay, thank you. That is all I have. Any questions?